It began like most HOA nightmares do, with a letter that didn't make any sense. The envelope arrived one Thursday afternoon, sandwiched between an electricity bill and a grocery store flyer. The paper inside was thick, official looking, stamped with the Homeowners Association's seal as if it were some government order. The words were printed in all caps, accusing me of a violation, erection of unapproved fencing structure. The problem was there was no fence. Not a wooden panel, not a chain link post, not even a strand of wire. All I had was an invisible dog fence, a harmless underground line meant to keep my Labrador, Max, from wandering into the street. It was invisible in the most literal sense. A buried cable no one could see without digging up my yard. Still, the HOA claimed it was unsightly and in violation of community aesthetics. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, someone on the committee had mixed up addresses. I walked to the edge of my yard, scanning every inch. The grass was neatly trimmed. The flower beds were well maintained. The fence was nothing more than an imaginary boundary in Max's mind. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They saw it as an unapproved structure and slapped me with a $250 fine. I read the letter again, each sentence more absurd than the last. It stated that my invisible fence disrupted the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. That was rich, considering my neighbor's rusting basketball hoop had been leaning into the street for 3 years. Yet somehow, my hidden pet boundary was the eyesore. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, certain I could clear things up with a simple explanation. But the meeting was a circus. The board members sat behind a folding table like some self-appointed tribunal. The president, a retired man named Carl with a permanent scowl, read my violation aloud as if it were a criminal charge. I tried to explain that nothing about my yard had changed, that there was literally nothing to see. But they cut me off, insisting their interpretation of the bylaws gave them authority over any fence, visible or not. The audience, mostly neighbors there to complain about unrelated issues, looked amused. One whispered something to another and stifled a laugh. I realized quickly that reason wasn't going to win this battle. The fine would stand unless I removed the fence, which, in their minds, meant digging up my lawn and cutting the underground wire. Walking home that night, a quiet anger began to build. This wasn't about property aesthetics. This was about control, and about the HOA flexing its power over something they couldn't even see. It was absurd, but instead of just paying the fine or ripping out the wire, an idea started to take shape. If the HOA wanted to accuse me of having a fence, maybe it was time to actually give them one. Not just any fence, but one so outrageous, so over the top, and yet perfectly within their own rules, that it would make their invisible violation look like a joke. I would build the most compliant, ridiculous fence the neighborhood had ever seen. The more I thought about it, the more the plan became intoxicating. I pulled out the HOA rulebook, the same one they like to quote when handing out fines. I read every line about fencing, height limits, material restrictions, approved colors. It was all there in black and white, and within those rigid lines there was room for something extraordinary. Something that would make their blood boil while being completely untouchable legally. Max sat at my feet, tail thumping against the floor as if he sensed the brewing mischief. The letter from the HOA lay crumpled on the counter. but I wasn't looking at it with frustration anymore. I was looking at it like a challenge. The HOA had picked a fight over something invisible. I was about to give them something they could never unsee. And it would all start with a trip to the hardware store. The Saturday after the HOA meeting, I cleared my dining table and spread out everything I would need: the HOA rulebook, a legal pad, and a steaming cup of coffee. If they wanted a fence, I was going to give them one that would live in neighborhood gossip for years. But it had to be perfect. One misstep outside their own guidelines, and they'd swoop in to tear it down. The rulebook became my blueprint. No fence could exceed 6 feet in height. Only approved materials could be used: wood, wrought iron, or vinyl. No garish or disruptive colors, which meant the standard beige, white, or natural wood tones. The rules were restrictive, but they also had gaps, little loopholes that the HOA had never thought someone might exploit. For starters, the bylaws said nothing about the shape of the fence panels. They said nothing about decorative elements, as long as they were structurally sound and made of the approved materials. They also never mentioned the density of the panels, only that fences should be visually harmonious with the neighborhood. That meant I could, technically, design a fence that twisted and curved, with every panel cut into bizarre silhouettes, as long as it was made of wood or vinyl and stood no higher than 6 feet. It could be outrageous without breaking a single rule. I started sketching ideas. My first design had fence posts carved like chess pieces, each one slightly taller than the last in a wave pattern. The panels themselves formed a zigzag pattern that would look chaotic, but still fell within the measurements. Another idea involved inlays, shapes cut out of the panels, backed with beige vinyl so they matched the approved color, but arranged in such intricate patterns that the whole fence would look like a giant optical illusion. Then inspiration struck from an unlikely source: Max's dog toys scattered on the floor. What if the fence was an homage to the very thing they find me for? My dog. A 6-foot wall of beige vinyl, carved with hundreds of silhouettes of Labrador heads, paw prints, and bones, all evenly spaced and perfectly aligned. Technically compliant, completely absurd. The more I thought about it, the more I liked it. The HOA could never argue it was an unapproved structure. It would be beige vinyl, 6 feet tall, set back exactly to code. But it would be unlike anything in the neighborhood. It would scream defiance without breaking a single bylaw. I made a list of what I'd need: vinyl panels, a jigsaw, a router, posts, cement. I called a local fence contractor to price out materials, pretending I was just looking for a standard vinyl fence. The quote came back steep but doable. If I was going to make this statement, I wasn't going to cheap out. That night, I paced around my yard, visualizing where it would go. The invisible dog fence still hummed silently underground, keeping Max contained. Soon, that boundary would be replaced by a wall the HOA would regret ever inspiring. I imagined Carl, the HOA president, standing in front of it, jaw tight, eyes twitching as he realized he couldn't stop me. The image was so satisfying that I caught myself smiling in the dark. The plan was locked. The design was ready. All that was left was to build it, but in HOA territory, nothing happens quietly. Word of my permit application was about to spread, and the board wouldn't take it lying down. The permit application was supposed to be routine. I filled it out carefully, attached every detail they could possibly demand: material samples, height measurements, a scaled diagram of the layout. I submitted it with the confidence of someone who knew they had followed the rules to the letter. 2 days later, the phone calls began. Not from the HOA directly, of course. They preferred their harassment to come indirectly, through whispers and neighborly concerns. Mrs. Lang from 2 houses down stopped me at the mailbox, feigning casual curiosity as she asked if I was really putting up a wall around the property. I could hear the suspicion dripping from her voice. By the end of the week, the HOA had sent an email blast to all residents reminding them about community integrity and the importance of preserving neighborhood charm. They didn't name me, but everyone knew. In a place like this, news travels faster than lawnmower engines on a Saturday morning. Then came the formal response, an official-looking envelope hand-delivered to my door. Inside was a conditional approval that read more like a list of threats. They acknowledged my fence met the written requirements, but insisted they reserved the right to request modifications if the finished product was deemed visually disruptive. That vague phrase was their safety net, their loophole to challenge me after the fact. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. They wanted me to second-guess myself, to water down the design, to fall back in line with their bland, uniform vision. I didn't budge. Construction was scheduled to start on a Thursday morning, and the moment the first truck pulled up, the neighborhood transformed into an audience. Curtains shifted, lawn chairs appeared on porches. Carl, the HOA president, walked by twice that morning without saying a word, just staring at the posts being unloaded. The contractor crew, blissfully unaware of the drama, worked efficiently. Post holes were dug, cement was poured. By the end of the first day, the skeleton of my outrageous fence was already visible. Each post perfectly aligned according to my layout. The gaps between them hinted at the design to come, the carved silhouettes, the intricate cutouts that would make this fence impossible to ignore. On day 2, the real spectacle began. Vinyl panels arrived in stacks, each one beige and perfectly cut to 6 feet. But by the time my jigsaw work was done, each would carry the playful rebellion I had envisioned. That morning, as I set up my tools in the driveway, Carl appeared again, this time with a clipboard. He circled the property slowly, making notes, pretending to inspect the sidewalk as if my fence posts were a matter of public safety. By the afternoon, I received an email stating that concerns had been raised about the project, and that the HOA would be reviewing the matter further. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of shaking a finger in my face. I ignored it. The crew continued their work, and my garage became a workshop of defiance. Each panel went under the jigsaw and came out transformed, cutouts of Labrador heads, paw prints, and bones repeating in a whimsical, perfectly aligned pattern. It was the kind of thing that made kids smile and certain adults seethe. By the end of the week, half the fence was up. My yard was beginning to feel like a fortress of creativity, one panel at a time, but the HOA wasn't done. That Friday night, I received a certified letter. They were requesting an emergency meeting to discuss possible violations in progress. It was laughable. The only violation they were witnessing was against their sense of control. Still, I knew their tactics well enough to realize this was only the beginning. They were preparing to throw every roadblock they could in my path before the final panel went up. But I had no intention of stopping. If they thought the first half of the fence was bad, they were in for a shock when they saw what I had planned for the last section. The final section of the fence was always meant to be the grand finale, the part that would turn heads, snap photos, and lodge itself permanently in the HOA memory. Up until now, the panels had followed my original plan, repeating silhouettes of Labrador heads, paw prints, and bones, all in perfect compliance with the rules. But the last stretch along the street, facing side, would be something else entirely. This was where I decided to push the design to its legal limits. I returned to the HOA rulebook, combing through every sentence for boundaries I could flirt with. Nowhere did it say the panels couldn't include layered elements. Nowhere did it forbid depth or dimension, as long as the materials were wood, wrought iron, or vinyl, and in approved colors. That meant I could add sculpted relief style features as long as they were part of the panel. So I designed a scene, a playful mural carved directly into the fence. It would show a giant Labrador, tail wagging, holding a bone in its mouth, surrounded by a field of paw prints that stretched across the final 8 panels. The details would be subtle from far away, but unmistakable up close. It was friendly, whimsical, and guaranteed to make Carl's blood pressure spike. The day we started installing this section, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. Word had already spread about the dog fence, and curious residents wandered by under the guise of walking their own pets or checking their mail. A few couldn't help but smile as they saw the intricate carvings taking shape. Kids pointed and laughed, but for every smile there was a disapproving glare from someone clutching their HOA-issued rulebook in their mind. Carl showed up twice that morning. The first time, he stood across the street, arms crossed, pretending to scroll through his phone while clearly taking photos. The second time, he walked the perimeter, stopping at the street, facing section, and staring for a solid 30 seconds before muttering something under his breath and leaving. By the afternoon, the fence was complete. The transformation was immediate. My one open yard was now framed by a custom work of art, perfectly beige, exactly 6 feet tall, meeting every single regulation while radiating an energy that said, "I read the rules better than you did." The contractor crew packed up, but the audience didn't disperse. Neighbors lingered, snapping pictures. Some came right up to the fence to run their fingers over the carvings. The local gossip mill was already in overdrive. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the fence took on a whole new personality. The carved shapes cast long, intricate shadows across the lawn, like a living art piece. It was impossible not to notice, and that was exactly the point. At 8:47 p.m., I received the email I had been waiting for, an official notice from the HOA requesting that I cease and desist further alterations to the fence pending a review for possible aesthetic disruption. The wording was careful as always. They couldn't point to a single rule I had broken, so they were fishing for one they could invent. I didn't respond. The fence was already finished, and there was nothing left for them to stop. What I didn't know was that the HOA was preparing a full-scale attack, not just letters and emails, but an attempt to rewrite the very rules that allowed my fence to exist. And that meant the real fight was about to begin. The HOA didn't waste time. By Monday morning, they had circulated a notice to all residents announcing a special emergency meeting to vote on amendments to the fencing regulations. Buried in the fine print was the real purpose: to retroactively ban decorative cutouts, carved designs, and thematic patterns from all fences in the community. It was a surgical strike aimed directly at my fence. The tactic was obvious. If they couldn't take down my fence under the current rules, they'd change the rules until they could. But retroactive enforcement was tricky. They would need a supermajority vote from homeowners, and even then, legal precedent was against them. My fence had been approved under the old rules. Forcing me to remove it would be an uphill battle. Still, I knew the meeting would be ugly. When the night came, the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, every seat filled with residents eager to watch the drama. On one side sat the board, stiff and composed. On the other, homeowners murmured among themselves. A few nodded at me in quiet solidarity. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Carl opened the meeting with a long speech about community values and visual cohesion. He spoke as if my fence was a threat to the fabric of the neighborhood, a dangerous precedent that would invite chaos if left unchecked. He never said my name, but every person in the room knew exactly who he meant. When they finally opened the floor to comments, it became clear the HOA had underestimated how the fence had been received. Several neighbors stood up to say they actually liked it, that it added character and personality to a neighborhood where every house looked like a copy of the next. One mother said her kids loved walking past it on their way to school. Another homeowner pointed out that the bylaws existed to ensure safety and upkeep, not to crush individuality. Of course, the loyalists countered. A few residents argued that allowing artistic fences would create a slippery slope. Someone brought up the dreaded example of a neighbor in another community who painted their fence neon green. The room grew tense as voices rose. I stayed silent, letting the backhand forth unfold. This wasn't about convincing the board. It was about letting the other homeowners see how petty and obsessive the HOA was being. The more extreme their arguments sounded, the more support shifted toward me. When the vote finally came, it was close. They managed to pass the amendment banning decorative cutouts going forward, but they fell short of the votes needed to apply it retroactively. My fence was safe, for now, but I could see in Carl's face that he wasn't done. Losing the retroactive clause had humiliated him, and humiliation in HOA politics is a dangerous thing. I knew the next attack wouldn't be through the rulebook. It would be personal. Sure enough, within a week, I began receiving new violation notices for unrelated offenses. My trash can was visible from the street for more than 20 minutes after pickup. My mailbox paint was fading beyond acceptable standards. My garden hose was improperly stored. Each notice came with a fine. It was harassment, pure and simple, a campaign to wear me down until I gave up. But if Carl thought I'd back down, he hadn't learned a thing from the fence saga. If anything, I was about to give him a reason to regret starting this war in the first place. The violation notices kept coming, each more absurd than the last. One morning, I found a fine for improperly positioned lawn ornament. A bird bath that had sat in the exact same spot for 4 years without comment. Another accused me of creating an obstruction by planting sunflowers along the fence line, despite them being well within my property. It was clear Carl was weaponizing the HOA bureaucracy against me. But bureaucracy works both ways, and I knew exactly how to turn it back on him. I started documenting everything: dates, times, photographs, even witness statements from neighbors who saw Carl pacing around my property. I pulled the HOA own bylaws and highlighted every instance where their enforcement process required formal steps they had skipped. For every bogus fine, I filed an official dispute letter citing those exact omissions. The paperwork piled up fast. I made sure to send every letter by certified mail, forcing the HOA to sign for each one. By the 3rd week, they were drowning in a paper trail of their own making. Then came the tipping point. During one of my late-night bylaw reading sessions, I stumbled across a clause that allowed homeowners to call for a special audit of HOA finances if they could secure signatures from at least 25% of the neighborhood. It was a rarely used provision buried deep in the documents, and it was the perfect weapon. Over the next 2 weeks, I went door to door with a clipboard. Some neighbors signed out of solidarity. Others signed out of pure curiosity about what the HOA was hiding. By the end, I had well over the required number of signatures. The odd, it was set in motion. When the results came back, they landed like a bomb. The HOA had been spending funds on miscellaneous administrative expenses. That turned out to be catered dinners, personal mileage reimbursements, and even a landscaping contract for Carl's private residence. The discovery didn't just embarrass the board, it infuriated the community. At the next HOA meeting, the turnout was the largest anyone could remember. Residents demanded resignations. Carl tried to defend the spending as necessary operational costs, but no one was buying it. By the end of the night, he and 2 other board members had stepped down. In the weeks that followed, the fines stopped. The harassment ended. The new board, eager to restore goodwill, even sent me a written apology for the misunderstanding over the invisible fence. And the best part, my fence still stood exactly as I had built it, 6 feet tall, beige, perfectly legal, and proudly decorated with Labrador silhouettes and paw prints. It had become something of a landmark, the unofficial mascot of the block. Kids still pointed at it on their way to school. Neighbors still smiled when they passed by. Carl had tried to make an example of me. Instead, he became the example of what happens when you push the wrong homeowner too far. As for me, I learned something valuable. In HOA territory, playing by the rules is the sharpest weapon you can have. And sometimes, the best revenge is not just winning, but winning so thoroughly that the other side never wants to fight you again. The invisible fence had started the battle. The real fence had ended it.